meeting. Our hope is that we want to spend tonight talking a little bit about what's been going on over the last 6 months, or 7 months, I guess, really, to be honest. And while many folks have been sheltered in place and navigating through masks and COVID, those sorts of things, we've been very active at the church and occurs to us that there's lots of things that happen that you just wouldn't know about. So we wanted to spend some time sharing that and celebrating what the Lord has done, and also talking about what the Lord has in store for us as we look into the future, and then some things that sit really on the horizon. We also want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. So we don't want to just talk about things. We want to actually hear questions you might have and be able to answer that. If so, there's an email address, and then there's a cell number that we have available. I think that's on the screen here for you. And so you can just send your questions in on text or an email. We'd love it if you begin by just telling us your name. It just will help us out. We're not going to mention your name online, but it just will help Glen as he's navigating through questions. And then if we can't get to all the questions, then we'll have an opportunity to be able to follow up later on. So we'll pick them up later. So March 13th, the shutdown. We had spent the week prior to that. That's a Friday the 13th. I guess pretty typical for me growing up in the 70s and all those Friday the 13th movies. And we've been bobbing and weaving all week long trying to stay open. And because we would say, we believe that the Lord has given His church the gathering as a way to rehearse the gospel and to remind ourselves what we know to be true. And we figured in the midst of a budding pandemic, all the more for us to be given this opportunity to gather together, to encourage one another. And so we've been bobbing and weaving all week long as executive orders and the governor and the mayor were beginning to say things. And on March 13th, we hear about a national news conference that the president was going to have. And we were hearing chatter about the National Guard. And we didn't know what that meant, and are they getting called out in the neighborhoods, that kind of a thing. And so we thought it's just time. It's time to throw in the towel. It's time to shut down and shelter in place in a way. And so I don't remember what exactly I asked, but I called Michael Gearhart, and I asked him a question. And Michael then calls Eric, and somehow or another, very quickly, we went into studio. Michael and Eric that evening dragged in personal camera equipment and borrowed camera equipment, and they grabbed some volunteers, and away we went. And one of the ways I describe it is we gave Eric and Michael the keys to Daddy's Porsche, and they did a great job. We went from 0 online worship presence to a fantastic online worship presence in a matter of 5 hours. As a matter of fact, in chatting with Aaron, he was sharing that some of the other churches in Indianapolis actually told their congregation to join us in our worship service because they just were not able to do what we did. Michael began editing what was recorded, and that first service wasn't done until 4:08 in the morning. Michael edited all through the evening, and I would wake up periodically to see if it was ready to be able to send out the links, and away we went from there. And one of the things I look back, and it's an opportunity really to talk about some of God's graces to us, some of the ways in which He was kind. If you remember, maybe you don't, maybe you do, Friday the 13th was going to be a time that we described as our night of worship. Tracy and Aaron had designed this thing, and already we're planning to have a worship service that evening. And so we had worship leaders that had already prepared and planned to come in. We had the tech team. We had all kinds of folks, volunteers and staff that were already going to be here to lead us in a time of worship, and they're already here. That's part of God's grace to us. I think another piece of God's celebration or grace for us is that there's not a lot of congregations that could say we have 2 trained filmmakers in their congregation, both of which grew up in the church, both of which have trained and have come back and loved the church and had access to the kind of gear that we would need to have access to be able to pull this thing off. And by the way, most of you wouldn't know, Eric has actually done this exact same thing, helping a handful of other EPC churches, both in the area and around, getting their online footprint set up, and he's just done a great job with that. Glen was in Orlando leading into that week?
Yeah, well, I'll give you my perspective on that Friday the 13th. I had been in Orlando the whole week from Monday through Thursday. I'm on a committee with our denomination, and we were there talking about how to ordain young guys and how to take them and women through this process. And I had blocked out on my schedule sermon prep for Friday. I was planning already to preach that Sunday, and I had blocked out Friday. And normally, if you know me well by now, I don't put things off till the last minute. But you can write a sermon on Friday if you need to. Well, while I was in Orlando, I just had this overwhelming impression that I needed to get the sermon done before I came home. So after the meetings, I would go back to my room each night and work on the sermon, and actually got that done by Thursday evening, which was great because when I got back on Friday morning, there was no time to prep a sermon that day. You know, we kept getting news that we might have to limit the gathering on Sunday, and I think we had about 13 different plans, by lunchtime. And, our plan before we called in Michael and Eric was, I thought we would set up an iPhone on a stand and make it kind of like a Bin Laden capture video, just the two of us. And was so glad that Eric and Michael didn't let us do the capture video.
It was a good thing.
But that was the plan. And so everything was, was moving real fast. I remember we crafted an email about what our plan was going to be. And Kathy pressed send on the email, and like 3 minutes later, the governor made a new statement.
Yeah.
And so then it looked like we were defying the government, and like we had to come up with a new plan and tell people, like, no, we're not defying the government, but things are changing. Yeah. And, in the middle of all this on that day, I remembered that my father was having a surgical procedure. I had actually forgotten, Mom and Dad, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I had forgotten that Dad was having a surgery that day. And when I called to check on them, and Mom was in tears. She said the surgeon came out, and she said, you all have called hospice, right? We knew Dad was sick. Dad's 91. But we didn't know it was that severe. So as all this is going on, I'm processing, wait, we got to call hospice, for my dad, and I got to preach, and we got to figure out how to live stream. And so it was, there's just a lot going on.
There was a time, and it was every day was different. Every day you'd come in, and any plan that we had developed was shot by about noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We at one point talked about setting up multiple sanctuaries in the building all around, in the loft and in the dining room and gathering place, trying to protect the gathering. That was really of great interest in us because we believe in the gathered believers together and the as a way in which the Lord nourishes us and encourages us. And yet, it became clear that we needed to go to what we called studio. And we were in studio for quite a long time, actually. We had to get used to participating in 2 worship services. So we would sing and we would preach in the middle of the week and record that. And then I would join my family and I would sing and I would listen to myself preaching. On Sundays, that was kind of a new experience for me, having to do that. My kids got an awful lot of mileage out of that kind of a thing, and it was hard for our worship leaders as they were navigating through, because they're so used to and they yearn for this connection as they lead worship, and it's a communal thing. They invite the congregation in, and of course, congregation wasn't here, and then you add lights and cameras and so it was hard. Tracy and Aaron did a fantastic job navigating through that, and they deserve lots of appreciation and celebration for that.
Rob, I was thinking about that first night when we were recording. It's been a long day, and congratulations to Tracy because she's trying to sing the last song. And it's, I don't know what time it was, like 10:30, 11. And Rob and I have just gone completely crazy is a word?
Yeah, I think so.
I didn't realize it, but I was marching in circles over at one side, and Rob was intentionally making faces at Tracy. Yeah. And so I think that last song got redone about 3 times.
I think it was 4 times. And the part you didn't mention is that Aaron actually, we hadn't done the traditional yet. I think Aaron was after that. And Aaron was very gracious and kind and patient with us as we were just train wreck.
We were a train wreck.
So,
Hey, and then 10 days later, you got COVID.
Yeah, but
You got more to say.
I did. That was exciting. I had more to say, but yeah. So I did. I got COVID and climbed into, well, I should say bed, but it really wasn't my bed. I got banished to the couch, and I was on the couch for essentially 18 days. I'd moved really from the couch to a recliner lazy boy a chair, and those were still right in the midst of executive orders and all kinds of stuff. And so it was a working COVID for me. We had session meetings in there somewhere or another. I have no idea what I said or what we did.
It was
all was
brilliant.
a blur. It was brilliant. I was brilliant through the whole thing. People think I should get COVID more often or something. I don't know. It was a real strain and stress, and yet it was a privilege to serve Jesus through that season. Executive orders coming out. Never read an executive order before in my life, and I read every one of them with great detail. And one of the things I was struck with, and just want to say thanks to the governor and really to the mayor, is that with all the executive orders that came out, they would affirm and clearly carve out space for us as a church for the proclamation of the gospel and for the care of our people. I don't know where the mayor or the governor are necessarily with their relationship with Jesus, if they have one, and where that's at. But they seem to value and appreciate the role of the church, and so they have fairly significant permission giving that they had given to us. And so I was thankful as we could navigate through that. Some of the values that we carried is we wanted to be submissive to those the Lord put over us, because we believe that the Lord put them over us. We wanted to be caring and loving to the congregation and to our community, and not put anyone at a risk nor unduly restrain or restrict them. And we were unwilling to compromise the gospel. I do not believe that a mask will block the gospel from being preached and proclaimed, but I sure would rather not to wear a mask. And so we've worked really hard to work with our government to be faithful to them, but there's a line which we were unwilling to cross. As a matter of fact, at one point we were talking about when the order came out about masks in Marion County, anytime you're inside, unless you could be significantly distanced, and so this would, I think, fall in that kind of a category. But we actually were talking about just picking up shop and going to my house, because I'm not in Marion County, and because we can then not be under those restrictions. But we decided that was following the letter of the law, but not the heart of the law. The Lord put us in Marion County, and in Marion County, we wanted to be faithful to who the Lord's put over us. We had to be creative. Want to be very creative in how we adjusted our ministry plans, and one of the things that we grabbed a hold of really early on was that the who and the why of ministry don't change. The when and the how is we need to be flexible with. And so we decided early on in our focus, we wanted to be really clear. We didn't overextend ourselves as a team, and we wanted to do worship really well. And remember, we were leading the prayer time, the Lectio Divina, and Glen was largely leading that. We did that well, and session got very active in calling through our congregation, and we wanted to keep Welcome Place and the kitchen open, because both of those groups were serving frontline workers and nursery programs. The school was doing a great job, and so we're really excited about that. But one of the things that occurs to us is that not only having an impact on worship, but it had a fairly dramatic impact on all of our ministries, and discipleship ministries were one of the things that really got struck hard.
Yeah, when we think about our discipleship ministries, and especially the ministries that disciple our young people, children and youth, wow, that was a big curveball thrown, because we had some things on the horizon called Kids Camp and Camp Pioka. And so, I mean, first of all, youth group, right, by name is a group, and so they can't gather. And so, Paul and August immediately go into holding youth group on Zoom. Melissa's making videos that she's sending out, teaching lessons to the kids. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Melissa did Vacation Bible School for the kids at Welcome Place, because they were already here. So they're thinking way out of the box. For a long time, we didn't know what was going to happen with our camps. And then Pioka made it easy for us, because they said they weren't going to have camps. And then Kids Camp, everybody that was going to be at Camp Happy Hollow canceled, and they said, we could pretty much pick any week we wanted and come. But when they sent us the guidelines, it wasn't going to look anything like camp.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't going to work at all. And then Melissa and August came up with the idea of camp, not camp.
Yep.
And so they came with a great idea of something that could be done locally. It was a hit. August and Melissa went around to every fifth grader's home, and I think gave them a Bible and invited them in to come on up to middle school youth group. So they were all really creative. Paul came up with a really creative thing called Parks and Rec that they did out of the shelter house. August was doing a daily devotional with the kids on Zoom. So they were all extremely creative and flexible.
Working hard to flex with what does ministry look like now. The who and the why stay the same, but how we've done it and the way we've done it in the past, it just didn't work anymore in this context. And so just adjusting, it was just remarkable.
Small groups learned to meet on Zoom even. I mean, even our senior population became very adept at using Zoom, doing things online. Some came and gathered in the parking lot and sat in a giant circle outside. And so there's a lot of creativity.
Yeah. So little did we know then, way back in the day, you remember they were talking, well, it's going to be for a little while, but in the summer it's going to go away and everything's going to be opened up. And maybe in the fall, we got to be careful again. And little did we know then what it would turn into. A few days, a few weeks, then turns into to months. And now we still sit here wondering what exactly is going to happen, right? After a bit, we learned it. We realized it's going to be long-term. And pretty early on in our process, we ran across an article by a guy by the name of Andy Crouch, and he was talking about shifting your thinking, and instead of considering it a blizzard, which is a lot of the language that was used, consider it a mini ice age, that this may be an extended time, and you may have to significantly adjust your ministry. And we began to ask, what does the shape of our ministry look like in the future, and how do we go about doing these things, and when will all this go back to normal, and what is normal, and is there even a normal as we go forward? And those are all questions I think that are still open. We're not exactly sure how all of this will work out. I think one of the questions that we wrestle with on staff here a little bit is, in what ways do we need to roll these things into our permanent ministry plans? Are we a horse and buggy church in a highway world? Are we trying to hang on to the ways in which we did ministry in the past because they were valuable, but now that things are different, do we need to adjust and change? And how long are those adjustments and change? So those are open questions for us. We don't know the answer, and so they sit there for us. You should be proud of the staff. They're actually being very creative, and while they don't like wearing masks, we wish it would all go back to the way it was. We're thankful that we're able to do as much ministry as we're able to do now. July 5th, we got word that we were going to be able to start regathering again. That was a Sunday that at that point masks were not mandatory, so we cooked up this great idea about how to give permission to our congregation, right?
For one Sunday.
For one Sunday. It was a great idea. We had some sections in our sanctuary that were mask mandatory because we knew there's some folks in our congregation that would feel more comfortable with that. We had some sections in our congregation, in our sanctuary, that would be mask optional because we know some in our congregation would feel comfortable with that. And there's some in our congregation that can't wear masks. And we wanted to give them permission to be able to come and worship. And then we opened the dining room because we knew that there'd be then others that would find that more comfortable. We were working really hard to give permission to the congregation to be able to come and worship, including maintaining the live stream footprint. The masks were not mandatory, right? Attendance actually started strong. Had 165 that first Sunday, and it's continuing to build. We had well over 200 this last Sunday, and when you add that to our digital congregation, I'll talk about attendance in a minute, it's a significant increase over what our worship attendance had been. In some ways, I think COVID caught us a little flat-footed. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so.
Yeah. The tide,
especially since we didn't even own a camera,
yeah, Well, we had your cell phone.
We had my cell
phone.
phone.
That was going to
all
be a
we
great
had.
plan. Eric and Michael said no to that, didn't they?
They did.
I know, they're cantankerous like that. Anyway, in some ways we got caught flat-footed, and the tide rolled out, and we got caught skinny dipping, right? Much of our ministry approach has had a large group and program-reliant components to it. Many of our ministries have that as a significant part of their ministry strategy, and that really becomes a fragile thing when you can't gather. If a large part of that of your ministry is designed around gathering together in groups, so we've been thinking much more through the lens of relationships and developing personal relationships and one-on-one and small group discipleship as a way to begin to think through how do we move forward in a way that a pandemic will not affect, and that ministry continue to be vibrant. And so that's one of the things we've been talking a lot about. It's difficult because developing those relationships are longer in scope, right? We also realized that our staffing wasn't in the right spot. We had our open DBO position. We filled that with Dave Heasley. We're really thrilled and just got a privilege. He's brilliant. It's going to be great on staff. But we also created a communications director, or director of communications role, because the scariest thing of all of this is I was the director of communications. It was my job to do social media, and my kids will tell you that that's a really bad idea to have me in charge of that. And we also created the video director role that Eric currently sits in, and as a really important part of our staff strategy as we move forward. And those are really all in many ways brand new positions. And the video director or the comms director position is still in the interview process. And when that gets filled up, we'll be introducing that person to you. And of course, one of the things that we would say is that relationship was really important, the one-on-one relationships, because that would allow ministry to continue even in the midst of shelters in places and those sorts of things.
Yeah, we talked a lot about Jesus' model, about how Jesus had 12 disciples, right? And he poured into 12, and he had 3 in particular that he poured into. He never neglected the masses, but his focus was on individuals. And COVID was a good reminder to us that, our focus, while we never neglect the whole group, but we each need to be focused on making disciples.
Yeah.
And you can make disciples whether there's COVID or no COVID.
That's right. Yeah. Finding folks to disciple you, and then finding folks to disciple is part of that road forward. Somewhere in there, we entered into a conversation that really is not a new conversation for Glen and I, for both of us. It's actually been a lot longer than we've actually been on staff together. For me, it's been an active conversation that's been over 4 years here, much longer for me, and for you, it's been a long conversation, and that would be the undivided stuff.
Yeah, I spent 10 years pastoring in the western North Carolina mountains, and it's a particular demographic that lives in the western mountains, i.e. there's no urban core in the mountains. And then in 2012, for me, this started, I went on a mission trip to South Chicago, south side of Chicago, and then we moved to Kansas City. In Kansas City, I pastored in the suburbs, but we had partnerships with 2 inner city churches. One was very much an urban core church, and man, my eyes were opened. There were just problems and concerns I'd never known about. We met, families who had adopted African American children. It was the first time I learned that, one thing had to be taught to this son and a second thing taught to this son. So all this was new to me. And then, come here to Southport Pres and realize these things are on Rob's heart also. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it stretches all the way back to middle school when I began to be introduced to a friend of mine, Darren, and beginning to realize that he was living in a different world than I was living in. And I didn't understand that as a 13-year-old. And then there's a long pause in the conversation for me. And over probably the last decade, it's just been a growing awareness and what I find is every time I talk with African American pastors, they tell me there's a problem. And it's a problem that I don't experience and I don't know. And so when we had a string of things in the country here, for me, one of the moments was really Dr. Cooper in New York City in the park with the woman who was threatening to call the police because, well, he wanted her to put her dog on a leash. And if I remember that story correctly, but the way in which she spoke to him, and it was a cauterizing moment for me. And that long after that, I mean, it was just before, I don't remember the timeline exactly. Of course, the nation got captured with George Floyd and all that had occurred with that. And so it just grew a burden on our heart that we felt like we needed to have a conversation. And one of the things that we have been told over and over again by folks who are people of color is that the white church is just silent. It just doesn't say anything about this. And yet everyone who is a people of color say that there's a problem. And so we just felt like it was important to get in the conversation. We were maybe clunky and messy in some points and probably would say some things differently if we were better at it. Certainly been trying to do a lot of listening and a lot of understanding, but also wanting to be courageous with the gospel. For us, this is not like an additional program, or it's not a new teaching initiative. It's not what that is at all. This is nothing more than the reflection of the gospel being applied into our community and in our culture. That I've come to see that there is an issue in the country, and the gospel is not being manifest clearly in that, and wanting to see the gospel appreciate the fullness of man and the image of God, regardless of color. I'm not colorblind. I see it very well, and I have learned to celebrate and want to learn to celebrate. We had some discussions where we watched a sermon and then talked about it, and then we had Phil came and joined us, and he talked about his experience, and then we had Patrick come and share his experience. And with each one of those events, it grew, the numbers grew larger and larger, actually. It was really, that was an encouraging thing. The conversations were not easy. These aren't easy conversations, and neither Glen or I are saying we've got this thing figured out. We just want to hear what God has to say about this stuff and learn to speak and think like he does about these things. I'm not sure if you've got anything else to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's the big part is conversation. And like Rob, every African American pastor I know has said there's a conversation that we need to have, and when you guys are ready to talk, we can have it. And it's pretty simple. It's a conversation, and I think biblically it's the second commandment, second greatest commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. It's simple. It's that simple.
Yep.
Right. It's that simple.
Well, yeah, and so the next steps of that conversation will be unfolding. There's a couple things that we've talked about. Patrick's been really a part of helping us think this through, and we're really thankful for him and his voice in this has been just a gift for us. One of the things that folks might be curious about is, well, what about attendance? What's been going on with attendance? And I just want to say, attendance has been strong and it has been increasing. One of the things that we believe and we've said is that worship of God is not dependent on a space or a building, right? That it's about the heart of the person worshiping. And while it was hard for many, you shared that, to be home on a video with worship, by all accounts and all measurements, our attendance has been up significantly. I'm not a math person, but it's been, I think it's been almost half as much up. I think part of that is we believe folks grew more consistent in their worship. We've been noticing a trend of folks worshiping less often. Southport Pres is their home, but they've been worshiping less often. And we think with shelter in place, of course, Sunday mornings became available. There was less to do, and we think that invited folks to join us more consistently. We know that we've had a lot of new folks join us, and some of those are friends and family members. Some of those are friends and family members that can't travel, and so they actually, for the first time, have been able to worship. We've had folks from around the world, global. Some of them are global partners from India, Taiwan. Mark and Michelle, hey, if you're joining us, it's good to see you. They actually brought their gospel center with them. And so what we the best we can tell, worship has increased. And why do I say it that way? Because we're working with YouTube analytics, and you can go cross-eyed trying to figure all that out exactly, and some assumptions that we have to make. But we assume for every device that is on, that's probably 2 people sitting behind it. We know for some it may just be 1. We also know the Hocks were there, and there were 6 of us, and the Masseys were there, and there were 5 of them, and so we figure on average it's probably about 2 folks per device, and so that's been really fun and encouraging. So I want to introduce you a little bit to finances, because that's a question. What's been going on with our finances through this? And so Joe Bucker's going to come up and talk a little bit about that. Joe is the chair of our stewardship committee. He's an elder here, and there you go. Take it away, Joe.
Thanks, Rob. I think at the onset of the pandemic, you all were thinking the same thing I was. It was, how is that going to affect me professionally? How am I going to get to go to work every day, support my family? How is it going to affect me personally? And with my kids being in college, is how were they going to go to college? And I think as stewardship chair, I also got thinking is, what in the world happens with church when I can't go to church? And so that got me worrying a lot. And I said, I think what we learned shouldn't have surprised us at all. Is, God has never abandoned us, never will. He is always faithful. And secondly was, the congregation is deeply in love. This congregation is deeply in love with Jesus Christ. I said, for what I'm grateful for that, I'm grateful, internally grateful to God for his faithfulness. And I just want to offer you, thank you for continuing to support Southport Presbyterian Church. I think we made some financial decisions over the course of the last several months that, I think you all should know about. And one is obviously pretty evident. We spent a little bit of money to be able to do the live stream that allows us to deliver a high quality service every week. Secondly, we made the decision to defer principal and interest payments for 90 days on our mortgage. We didn't know what was going to happen to contributions, so we felt that was a prudent thing to do. That has since gone back. We've continued to pay the bank and remain in good standing from that perspective. And lastly is we applied for and received a payroll protection program loan from the SBA. That just gave us a little bit of flexibility to weather whatever the pandemic had to throw at us. We were confident that God was there for us, but we just wanted to be prudent with what he had given us. Despite the pandemic, financials remain strong. And frankly, during my time in stewardship, I'd say they're stronger than they've been in a long time. Cash balances are strong in part because of the PPP loan proceeds, but also because department heads and the staff have done a fantastic job of controlling expenses. And lastly is contributions, and is the contributions that you all give to support the church. And year to date, they're approximately what we had budgeted, maybe a little bit behind in the last couple months, but it's yielded, basically our contributions have exceeded our expenses year to date by a large sum, $163,000 through August, and we're just grateful for that. I'm glad to answer any questions you have at the end, so we appreciate it.
So Joe assured us he'd only talk for 3 minutes, and sure enough, Joe talked for 3 minutes, and yet great things to celebrate. And it really is your faithfulness and your sacrifice. We say every Sunday that every dime you give goes directly to ministry, and it does. And you've enabled us to continue to support missionaries on the field, global partners. You've been able to enable us to continue to do ministry here on site. A couple things Joe would have mentioned if he didn't want to get it in 3 minutes. I'm kidding, Joe. We actually applied for a grant and a $20,000 grant, and that actually helped us purchase equipment, camera equipment, and the such for our live stream stuff. And so that was really a significant thing to be able to step into it. We also made a decision really early on in the process that we wanted to ensure that none of our staff were harmed. we're thinking about welcome place and thinking about the kitchen primarily would be the ones that we thought were particularly vulnerable. And so we as a team established 80% as a basement level, that all of our staff would be paid at least 80% of their salary or what they would earn, regardless if we have the hours for them. So in the kitchen, if we didn't have as much work, we wanted to ensure that at no point would a staff member drop below 80% of their normal income as a way to care for them and love them. And the details are fuzzy, but truth is it turned out to be just a fantastic gift for them. We had a number of staff members cry when we shared that with them because of our commitment to care for them. JT Diener is going to come up. JT is an elder. He's leading a group of 3 elders and a really brilliant dude to just do some horizon-looking forecasting. I don't know how you want to describe. What in the world are you doing, JT?
Well, thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do my best to describe some of the work that we've been doing. As we are, really what we're doing is exploring how God's moving and where God is calling us to. So I'm here a little bit representing Session to make you aware of some of these conversations and that we suspect that God is moving us towards something new. And in an effort to be as transparent and open as possible, I just want to share a little bit about how we got here and sort of where we think God is leading us. So as we were preparing to hire a new DBO, which is really exciting, we had some questions about appropriate salary ranges for that position. And as I said, I think in one of the session meetings, that was a little bit like a sweater that had a thread on it that we started to pull. And as we pulled that thread, we ended up with a ball of yarn and no sweater because we realized that we have some opportunities that God has put before us to head in some new directions, we think. And so what are those opportunities? There are really 3 significant opportunities that we have before us. One of those is staff pay. We have a fantastic staff that has been highly adaptable in the midst of really a chaotic 9 months due to COVID. They have navigated certainly better than I could have, and probably most of us, through times of high uncertainty and change. We are enormously blessed to have them working here and caring for us and the people in our community. However, we have not regularly prioritized raises in our annual budgets, and as such, our staff salaries are lagging behind others in the area. And so we need to work to adjust those as quickly and as prudently as possible, as many of those salaries are suppressed. We also have approximately $1.7 million left on our mortgage after nearly 25 years being on this property. And this building is not getting any younger. Our trustees have been working with lots of different vendors to estimate what sort of repairs we may need to make in the coming years. And we are estimating that there is upwards of $800,000 in repairs needed for the roof, for the parking lot, and HVAC and some of the other things that we'll need to work through. The most pressing of those appears to be the roof at this point in time. And so as we discussed those in session, there was a group of 4 of us that were put together to explore how do we try and address those needs and how is God leading us. And so one of the places he led us to was the story of Elijah and the widow in 1 Kings. And so I won't read that to you, but I will sort of summarize and say Elijah was starving in the desert, and he came across a widow and asked her for some bread. And she gave that bread to him, not out of her abundance, but out of her scarcity. And God provided for them for the duration of that drought that they went through. In a similar manner, we are convinced that God wants to provide for us in some different ways, and we are pursuing him and how we will move forward. So Southport Pres, if you don't know, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 years old. And there are times when the leadership of the church, who are elected by the body, come into times where significant decisions must be made about the direction of the church. 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago, when this land and building were bought and purchased was one of those times. It was a significant decision in the life of this congregation and has greatly impacted us even today as we stand inside the building. The leaders of that time prayed, sought God, and determined that this building and land was the way that God was moving and wanted us to move towards. There was a much sacrifice by those who have gone before us to follow God so that he could provide the building that we have and the reserves that we currently have. Session suspects that we may be on the front end of a similar time now here at Southport Pres. In the last 25 years, there's been significant changes in culture at large and spiritually at our own church. We have new senior pastor, I would say almost an entirely new staff. We have new emphasis on small groups and how we do ministry in our local community with Mary Bryan. We're in an entirely new denomination, which impacts how we are working and who owns our property. And certainly, we're all aware of COVID and the impact that has had on culture as a whole, but also on us as a church and individuals. We are not the same congregation and people we were 25 years ago, and thank God for that. The discussions we're embarking on are in no way meant to trample, forget, or minimize the sacrifices that many of you made almost 25 years ago. This discussion is in fact enabled by the faithfulness of the saints that have gone before us. With so many changes in culture and at Southport Pres, we would be negligent as leaders if we didn't ask questions about how God wanted us to move forward in our current environment. And I think I speak for all of session to say that none of us wants to show up at the gates of heaven and say that we were negligent. And so it's for those reasons that we're asking some of these questions. So I want to be very clear that we are in the very early stages of this process. We spent about the last 6 weeks just gathering information to digest and determine the best path forward. We are now asking some of those questions now that we've come through a time of gathering that information. We're asking how we can pay staff better, how we can pay for building repairs, and how we can try and pay off the mortgage as aggressively as possible. We know that God has a plan for us as we work through these things, and one of the first things that we suspect that God is calling us to do is sell off some of the land that we have. We don't know what that parcel of land looks like. We've gotten some estimates on various different cuts of the land, but based on what we know, the land has significant value right now. And there are plots of land that we can sell without significantly impacting any of our ministry values or rhythms. And we want to share this with you because the land and building is owned by the congregation. And in order to sell the land, we all have to vote to approve the sale of any land. We want to make sure that we're bringing you along on this journey as quickly as we know information, as we suspect the Lord may want us to move quickly through this process. And to that end, Session heard most of this information in detail just on Saturday night, which was only 2 days ago. So this has to be one of the most expeditious things to ever happen in a Presbyterian church. And at this point, we feel a little bit like the widow in 1 Kings. We've been asked to share some of our resources to further the kingdom of God. We don't know what all the implications are for that. We don't know what we may have to sacrifice, but here's what we do know. Our mission to love God, love each other, and serve the world hasn't changed at all. Our vision to share Christ with those who we come in contact with because of what Christ has done for us hasn't changed in any way. What we suspect is changing is how we use some of our resources. And the invitation is for us as a body is to pray and seek God's face for how he wants us to move forward. So pray for session as we seek and discern to care for you all well. Pray that we will be wise as we move forward, and pray that our loving Heavenly Father would make it abundantly clear to us how he wants us to care for the people that he loves in the Southport and Indianapolis area. Thanks.
Thanks, JT. So it would be fair to say the session is grappling and wrestling with some weighty stuff. The heart and the hope really is no different than it's always been, and that's to build a kingdom and make much of Jesus Christ. And in many ways, I think one of the things that I heard JT sharing, and I know he said to me offline a number of times, is that it's really the faithfulness of you, the saints that have gone before, that really encourage and strengthen the same kind of faithfulness as we go forward, making courageous decisions if that's what sits in front of us. So certainly pray for session along those lines, and thanks, JT. Hey, I want to bring up Kendra Decker and Matt Smith. They're going to talk a little bit about CNC and what's going on with our nominating committee for our officers.
Hi there, church. Kendra Decker, and I am reporting to you tonight from the CNC. And for those of you who don't know, CNC stands for Congregational Nominating Committee. So just to give you an overview of who actually is on this committee is Matt Smith, Gary Lee, and I are all elders on the committee. Our deacon rep is Nancy Kemp. Our trustee rep is Dan Clevenger. And then our at-large members are Judy Carey, Kim Clevenger, Romel Pina, and Eric Thine. So just to give you an idea of what's been happening with us, back in July, we started meeting and praying over who God was going to be calling to serve here at our church. And that has been going on every day since then. At this point, we nominate 4 individuals to serve 1 year for CNC, and that is filled. So we thank Jesus for that. Every year we nominate 4 trustees to serve a 3-year term, which brings the trustees total to 12 members at all times, and those are currently filled. So praise Jesus for that. We also, right now, nominate 13 deacons to serve 3-year terms, which brings the deacon total to 39. We currently have 7 who have agreed to serve as deacon, and we do have individuals still praying and slots that we are still seeking. So please be in prayer for that. Each year we nominate 6 elders to serve a 3-year term, which brings our elder total to 18. Right now we have 5 individuals who have committed to serving as elder. Thank you, Jesus, for that. So the biggest thing that we are asking for our congregation right now is to be in prayer with CNC over this process and over the individuals, one, who have already said yes, and also for those individuals God is still leading to us. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Smith.
Good evening, everybody in Southport Presbyterian. I'm Matt Smith. I'm one of the members. I'm actually an elder on the Congregational Nominating Committee with Kendra and with Gary Lee and the other members that she mentioned. Let me just first say that it's been a pleasure for me and a blessing from the Lord to serve on the committee and also on session. I think growing up, you hear about those offices, and I don't know if you'd say you aspire to be one, but you look up to them, and it's because they're faithful men and women that are on there. And I can say that that's true of everybody on session, and it's a privilege to lead with them, to meet with them, to discuss and pray, and to lead the church. And so it's just been a real honor for me to be on session and on the Congregational Nominating Committee. And as Kendra mentioned, one of the tasks that we're charged with as the Congregational Nominating Committee is to pray over and consider who is the Lord leading to the church to fill these offices. And she went through just a moment ago and mentioned that we've got 4 members on the nominating committee, 4 trustees, 13 deacons, and 6 elders. And throughout this process, it's been wonderful. But one of the things that the Lord has laid on our heart and brought to session for us to start to consider and start to have a conversation about is whether or not that number in each office is the appropriate and the right number and in the right spot for our church. One of the conversations that sits overarching this is we've also been considering what is the purpose of the session and elders. Is it to be managers over certain committees, or are we shepherds of the church? We feel like the Lord is leading us to be shepherds. What is the role of deacons, and are they fulfilling their call as such? And so we're having that conversation. And the biggest thing that we wanted to communicate to you is that as a session, we are feeling strongly led to reconsider the number of individuals that would fill those offices. And so we just want to make you aware as the church that that's something that we're praying about and considering, and again, want you to journey with us on. One of the things that we have looked at is we've looked at other organizations and specifically churches that are nearby. And one of the things that I noticed very quickly is that we have a very large session with 18 people. Most of the other church, actually all of them, there's no church greater than 12 as their number of session and board members, depending on the church. And so one of the things that we are just discussing and considering is 18 a large number to make decisions and to be able to move and adapt and move with where the Lord's leading the church and to make decisions not hastily, but in a quick manner to respond. And so we just want to make you aware as the church that that's the conversation that we're having. And as session, I think I can speak for session clearly that we feel pretty strongly and moved that numbers probably needs to be less. We don't know what that number is exactly, but just less because we just think that that's where the Lord is leading us. And we think that as a session and as deacons, we can fulfill our mission and what the Lord has called us to do with potentially fewer people. So as a congregational nominating committee and an elder on that, we just wanted to make sure that you are aware as a congregation that that's the conversation that we're having so that you're not taken by surprise. And as we had that conversation on session, I think it was very fruitful, and we were all in agreement that that's the direction that we believe the Lord is leading us to. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Rob and Glen.
Thanks, Matt. I think it'd be fair to say with both what JT has shared and what Matt would share is that maybe a way to describe is that session's very much in a discernment process, and both of these things actually come up through session, and they're asking the question, Lord, what would you have for us? What would it look like for us to be faithful to you? And so this is just the beginning of a conversation that session's been having, that they want to be transparent with you about that. No doubt we'll be sharing more as clarity may or may not come, and these decisions actually sit with you anyway. So it's going to be important to have that conversation together. So we promised that we'd create some time and some space for y'all to ask some questions and for us to interact. Maybe it's clarification on some things we've shared. You didn't understand what we said or want just more information, or maybe it's something we didn't talk about at all. So Glen's been over here. He's receiving the questions on text and on email, and so.
Yeah, I was not playing Candy Crush
You were not?
while you were talking.
Yeah, you've already mastered Candy Crush, I think.
Reading,
isn't it? Yeah.
Questions. So yeah, we have some questions, and there's a good chance we won't get to all of them. And so if we don't answer your question, then we want you to call us here at the church office or reach out to us because your questions are important. Rob, here's an easy one. Somebody wants to know, when are the donuts coming back?
Glen, when are the donuts coming back?
When are the donuts coming back?
As soon as possible, right?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think whenever we feel safe enough that, I don't know, there's a vaccine, the numbers are getting less on COVID. I mean, right now the concern is, any place where everybody's, touching stuff. And I suppose we could put them all out on little plates and, spread them out a little bit. But
Yeah, and I think that's probably true. And even then, when we begin to hit more full rhythm, right? One of the things we know is that things will not all be the same. We won't be passing, anything in worship any longer. We don't believe in the future. There won't be bulletins, almost certainly being passed out. And so any of those common touch points we've tried to eliminate in the meantime, and it's hard to see those things coming back. But I do think we can find a way for the donuts to be in the building without lots of touch points. I think that's really important.
So here's a question, Rob.
Yeah.
How do you see the mission of Southport Presbyterian Church changing in the months and years ahead? So that I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah.
How do you see the mission of our church changing?
Yeah. So I would say the mission of Southport Pres doesn't change at all, actually. Our mission is to love God, love each other, and serve the world. I think maybe the question is, how does our strategy change, which sometimes folks will, that's really what they're talking about when they say, what's the mission? I mean, how are we going to do these things? Well, I describe that as a strategy, and I've touched on some of those things. I think that we need to be doing more and investing more in small group discipleship as we navigate forward, which then I think is a more effective way to do ministry anyway than just strictly a gathered event kind of a thing. I think there's a place for the gathering. I'm not really even referring to worship. I mean large group gatherings that collect people together and then has a program. But really undergird that with a more robust personal discipleship kinds of things. I think that's going to be one of the heartbeats of it.
So really our mission is always the same.
Always
really,
the
it's
same.
given to us in the Scriptures.
Yep.
And it's how we accomplish it is how we have to get creative.
The strategy, absolutely.
Now, this is a two-part question. There's a message that we share to the community. We call it the gospel, the good news.
Yep.
And what would you say is the heart of this good news message that we're called to present to others?
Yeah.
What's the heart of it?
What I'd say is it's a message that it's as old as time. If you look through the book of Acts, there's 19 sermons that are preached in the book of Acts, and that's the message of the gospel as it was described then. It's the message that we preach today, that Jesus Christ was crucified, dead, buried, and rose from the dead. It's the good news of the gospel that never changes. How we go about communicating that, some of the language we might use might change in a context, and so the communication that gets put around that to contextualize the gospel. Sometimes in some context it makes people nervous. But I just want to say really clearly, the gospel itself doesn't change. It's Jesus Christ, crucified, dead, buried, and raised from the dead. It's the message.
And our message doesn't change, right? It's the
not at all.
message that God gave us this message. And,
Absolutely.
And we share it. And, one of the things that's on my heart with this message is it takes people time to wrestle with it. And so one of the things as a church, boy, we want to give people space to where they can come and hear the message and wrestle with it. I know everybody in our congregation, unless you grew up in the church and, you were just in Sunday school from the time you were one, if you came to Christ as an adult or a college student, I bet you there was a period of time, probably a couple-year period, where you were wrestling with these claims. And it's so important for non-Christians when they're wrestling with the gospel to get inside of our community so they can see how we live, how we treat each other, how we talk to each other. Right. There's got to be some way to see the gospel working out in our lives. And we want to give people that space.
A room to rise up and grow, which means that sometimes we'll have messy people with us. The other is, if you're new to Southport Pres, you'll hear us talk about the gospel not simply as a thing that gets us into eternity, like it's the first step in a staircase. We talk about the gospel encompassing all of it, from coming to know Christ and then growing in fullness in our life in Christ. And so we talk about the gospel in this really robust, broad way that it includes our transformation, that our lifestyle looks more like Christ. And so I think about Paul, how often he says, remember the gospel. And he says that to people who are not practicing a lifestyle consistent with the gospel. He says, remember the gospel. And I don't know that we ought to believe that who he's talking to forgot that Jesus died. I think what he's saying is we have to remember the effect of the gospel in our life. We have to return to that over and over and over again as our lives are then changed and transformed. And so we want to create space for that as well, right? Not just for folks that are coming who may not trust in Jesus or may not even know Jesus at all. All this is brand new. Their lifestyle may may reflect that. But even after coming to know Jesus, to allow space for them to grow into the fullness of life.
Okay, a couple of questions about Undivided.
Yeah.
And so one question is, are these undivided conversations, are they a distraction from what we're called to do, and are they potentially divisive? And then there's another one, but we'll go with those first.
Are they a distraction? I'd say no. They're not really a distraction the way we have talked about it, the way that we're thinking about it, and have looked at the undivided conversation, is that this is actually a reflection of the gospel in our culture, in our days, that this is not an addition, this is not a new program, this is not a new initiative. This is really the gospel being played out into a place in our country in which the gospel has not touched well. That there's a group of people who are saying to us that the image of God is not able to be robustly celebrated. And so we're concerned about that. And we think it's the gospel that goes there. And so it's the gospel that drives us into this as much as the gospel has us driving into what we think about abortion or what we think about taxes or government and elections. The gospel plays out in all these areas, and it's the gospel then that drives our thinking about it. Might it be divisive? Well, the intent is not to be divisive. We think the conversation's hard. We've worked to try to be gentle about that and not be harsh, but like Glen talked, to create space, to wrestle with these things, to not make this a litmus test of, or this be like a value shaming kind of a thing of our virtue, and we want to create space for folks, but it's hard, and anytime we had hard conversations, of course, it's going to create some frustration and some even at times a distance in relationships. I've been married since 1995. Let me tell you, we've had some hard conversations that were really good and necessary that did create what felt like division. But as we maintained and were committed, my wife and I, to that relationship, we were able to navigate through those things. And so we're working hard to be gentle and careful and kind, knowing, of course, that we have folks of color, people of color in our congregation who are working really hard to be patient with the conversation, who have waited perhaps their whole life to be able to have an open conversation about what it's like to be a person of color and to be looked at differently.
Rob, one of the things I thought about is this divisive? And I thought, really, any passage of Scripture we get up to preach is potentially divisive, right? Anytime we open the Scriptures and say, here's God's message for us, and anytime our idols are exposed, it can be divisive.
And it's amazing when you look at the Gospels, right? One of the things that is just overwhelming is that nobody has a lukewarm response to Jesus. You either love the guy or you hate the guy in the Gospels. Like there's really no in between period, which just speaks really to that. And so pastorally, we try to be really kind and careful and gentle as we share what we believe is what God would have for us.
Now, I'm going to ask the next question, and I'm going to answer a little bit, and because I've already read it, and then you can add to my answer. But the question is, I'd like to know how we as a church unite and be a voice in this time of racial unrest beyond talking among ourselves. It's a great question. How do we have impact in the community other than just talking internally? And I would say, for starters, these internal conversations are really important. Because, as we found, we just said we're going to have conversations, and before we even had the conversations, we realized people are not on the same page, and, we're certainly aware that this has got to be more than just us talking internally, and, we're grateful in this process that the Lord has brought us into relationship with a guy named Phil who works at Shepherd Community, and Phil has shared with us some things that he does to help churches take more steps forward in this. And so we're grateful that God has brought Phil to us. I know at the church I pastored in Kansas City, we had these kind of conversations, and I'll tell you, they got really heated. I mean, really heated. It was good heated. People got really honest, and one of the outcomes is we ended up partnering with an urban core church. I went down and preached a sermon. I told Rob about this week. You know me, I preach with a manuscript, and I knew a manuscript sermon wasn't going to work there, but I knew I couldn't preach otherwise, so I manuscripted as if I were preaching to an African-American congregation. And then Pastor Tim came and preached at our suburban congregation, and I said, Tim, they're just going to stare at you. They're not going to make a sound. And it was a great experience for both of us. So we found that once we started interacting with another church, and it just helped us to understand better, because it's no longer a concept. I mean, suddenly it's Pastor Tim, and it's people from his church.
Yeah. And in fairness, one of the things that we have heard from folks is that sometimes a church like ours can just move too quick, and we can rush in to engage with other congregations or in activity, and so it's really, what we've heard is really important to spend time as a community wrestling through these issues, and because it puts us in a better position to be partners in ministry, and as well as engage in that conversation in ways that are not offensive but are fruitful.
Yeah. So there's a part of that question was, do we also have a position on abortion, homosexuality, immigration, caring for widows and orphans? And what I would recommend is if you go to the EPC website, and it's pretty simple, it's epc.org. As Presbyterians, we have position papers on everything. And so you can go read. We have position papers, I know, on abortion, homosexuality. We have stuff on marriage. And I'll tell you, Rob and I, we hold to what our denomination has written. We're in agreement.
Yeah, as with the session.
And
we have committees that sit behind those position papers to write those.
Yep.
Because we're Presbyterians.
Someone asked, could we elaborate on what part of the land is being considered to sell? What part of the land are we talking about? JT's coming up.
There's
to
JT.
answer that.
All right.
Thanks, Glenn. So the real answer is we don't know. We've started working with some folks to try and assess what plots of land may be the best to divide up and sell off. We've talked about it a little bit at session, but there's still lots of work and exploration to be done there. We don't know. There's an opportunity there, but it's unclear to us what that opportunity looks like. I would say what looks like would have the least impact on us from a ministry rhythms and how we operate perspective would be probably the north lot, which is closer to the apartments. But like I said, where those lines are drawn and exactly how all that shakes out is very unclear at this point.
Okay, and let's see, there's a couple messages on here that just say thank you to all the staff for everything that they're doing. Thanks to all the staff. Let's see, what else we got? Question about, here's a good one. Church and state authority. And so in what way does the state have authority over the church? Does taking this loan in any way give the authority over us? And, at what point might we take a stand against the state?
So I'll start taking a crack at that, and then you can clean up and make sure I get it right. What I'd say is authority over the church from the state. The church's authority is Jesus Christ. We submit to Christ as our king, and as we read Scripture, what we understand is the Lord has put civil authority over us. Think about Romans 13 or Titus 2, some passages that talk about how the Lord has placed folks over us. As you see a number of passages in the Old Testament as well that will kind of tease this out, and that authority is not driven from the morality or immorality, the faithfulness or lack of faithfulness from the government that's placed over us, right? And so the posture is that our God asks us to be submissive to those governing authorities he puts over us. There's a limit, of course, because our king is Jesus Christ. And so we serve our king. And so where is there a limit? Well, it would be any place where the government asks us to do something our king tells us to do different, right? So for me, right, one of those lines, one of those ditches is the gospel. I don't mind preaching through a mask. Not my favorite thing. Thankful we're able to do these panel things, which is clearly not my favorite thing either. But if that's what it means, I'll do that. But if they tell me to change the gospel, that's not happening. And if they come in and they arrest me and take me to prison, then I'll go happily and say, yep, I knew what the rule was. You told me not to preach the gospel, but I'm bound to Jesus Christ as my king, and I will not compromise on that. In terms of the loan, the PPP, what was?
Yeah, we took a loan.
Yeah.
We were given a loan, and does that in any way give
Kind
the
of.
government authority over us?
Yeah, so it's kind of a loan, kind of a grant. We actually looked at it. We don't think it actually compromises us in any way or places authority over us. So if you don't know much about the PPP, there's lots of details that I don't have time to really get into, and probably don't even have the knowledge to get into fully. It covers payroll, it covers a number of things, and as long as you spend that money along the lines that's been given to you, it's forgiven as a grant. We don't believe it creates an issue for us in terms of authority, that it's some way in which the camel's nose is now under the tent, or some string that we get attached with at this point. So we don't think it puts us in a compromised position as a church in our faithfulness to Christ and his gospel and the community. We actually are just about, the portal is just about open. What does that mean? It means to walk through the process of confirming that we don't have to give any of it back, that we actually have used it for the way in which it has been given and done it fully. All the bank people around here, what they say is, we're fairly certain it'll be forgiven. And I finally said, well, what does that mean? It says, it means that I'm a banker and I don't ever want to say completely no doubt about it, but I think there's lots of reasons for us to think that loan will be forgiven and fully, and it actually turns into a grant, then not a loan.
Okay.
So,
A couple more questions have come up about land, and one is, this just seems kind of abrupt. Is this abrupt need to sell church property? Did this catch us by surprise? Did no one notice that financial needs were developing? This feels sudden.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's been, I think, lots of things that have been talked about in different venues in stewardship. I know as the chair of personnel last year, I sat on stewardship as a part of my responsibilities, and the sale of land came up then. And so it's been talked about in different ways, but I think what's happened over the last few weeks is that session feels that God is really trying to move us in a direction to sell the land, and not beyond just talking about it in small groups or saying like, hey, I think maybe we should think about this at some point in time. But that some point in time is now, and so we are trying to pursue that as faithfully as we can. And regarding some of the financial things. I think for a long time we have had we've had a bit of a scarcity mindset around our resources, but for lots of reasons we feel we may have the capability to try and address some of those things. Some of that coming through the PPP loan and grant, and if we can work to adjust some of those salaries and things like that, we want to, but it's still forming, and it's really, this whole process is in its infancy. But I don't know that I would say that we have been unaware, but we certainly feel God moving and wanting to address those things for us as a community.
Okay. And then this one, so I'll just answer this one. So, someone asked about the widening of Emerson. What do we know? You may not know there's a plan to widen Emerson Avenue to make it 2 lanes. And all we really know about timeline right now is they sent us a letter saying that they're going to need a little bit of our land, right? But they didn't tell us which land or any of that. Do you know any more about that?
Yeah, I do.
Of course you do.
Yeah. No, why are you so surprised
Why am I surprised?
that I know more about
Well, you
this?
can just tell us what you know.
Yeah, they actually have, they've sent information about what land they would want, and actually, if you had been around the building, I'm not even sure they're still there, but they'd even set up some stakes and some flags about here's what they think that they'd like. So no doubt we'll begin a conversation with them about how much they want that land and what that looks like for them to compensate us for the land that they're going to take. Because what they're wanting is more than an easement, is what it looks like to me, though not an area of great specialty for me. I've got an MDiv, not a MBA. Joe, is that about right? Joe says I was perfectly correct in all things, or something like that. So.
All right, Rob, so you're going to like this one.
Oh, I am.
Okay.
I've liked them all so far.
You do like them all.
I like them all, yeah.
Behind you is a Volkswagen Bug and a
Yeah.
peace sign
Okay. Yeah.
and some other things. How does Woodstock background help us in worship?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, if you were with us a couple weeks ago, let me back up further than that. So when we go about figuring out what I'm gonna preach, I begin normally about 6 or 8 months before a sermon series, beginning to pray and discern, both about direction and movement. I begin to think about how that sermon series is going to break up, and what passages and the order of those things, how to begin to communicate it as a whole, and then what each of those sermons look like. And then when I get closer to the sermon, we begin to have conversations about what it is we might do with what we call our worship set. Worship arts is a way to try to create an environment that would invite folks into the conversation or into the sermon. And then the week I'm preaching is hours and hours in terms of study and preparation before Sunday morning. And that's true for me as it is for Glen when we step into the pulpit. So know that by the time that we get into a pulpit or to preach a sermon, it's been a really significant amount of time of study and discernment, right? Okay. In February, I began to get the sense that the Lord wanted us to walk through the Beatitudes, and one of the things I think that is true is that, like I said earlier, Jesus was not. No one was neutral to Jesus. They either loved him or they were agitated and they were frustrated with him, and that's normally one of the only two reactions that you get. And one of the things that began to dawn on me is that first century was really fairly chaotic. Lots of expectations on him about who he was and what he was going to do, and that the Beatitudes was his first introduction to them publicly. Now, Matthew 4 talks about how he was in Galatia and he preached and he healed, and so it wasn't the first time he had begun to talk about the gospel or the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew would describe it, but it's the first time that Matthew recorded him teaching, and the Beatitudes are his first moment of teaching. And so we kind of landed on this, or I landed on this notion of, in many ways, he's bringing a spiritual revolution. Some would prefer for me to use the word reformation, and that's okay. It's really very similar. And began to think about the Beatitudes through the lens of like a manifesto. But I thought that language sounded harsh and militant, and I was concerned about that for our congregation. I didn't want to have that edge for us, and so I began to think, how could we soften that edge to be more gentle and to be more gracious? And I just remember growing up in the 70s and watching the Monkees on Saturday morning, and watching the Wonder Bug and Hong Kong Phooey and Scooby-Doo, and learning how to play Yellow Submarine on a xylophone in first grade. And I just remember singing the Coke commercial to people walking across the fields. And so I thought, these are memories for me that are light and are easy and are joyful, and I thought, oh, well, that would be a great way to soften. Apparently, that's not the only way to remember that time, and is a complete miss on my part. And I've been actually really struck at how agitated and how much emotion that the set design has created, and that really wasn't the intention. It was an attempt to soften the language. When we think about worship arts, though, we're not thinking the only imagery that's available to us, it would be sacred imagery. And so if the question is, why are there flowers and why aren't there crosses or Christian symbols, then we think we have a broader array of imagery that we can use. We're also aware that our congregation is very broad, and I want to say for as many folks that have created negative emotions, it actually has created positive emotions. And so in many ways, it's really created very strong emotions on both sides. Some love it and some hate it. And again, it was a complete miss on my part. Like, I thought this would be softening and fun. So,
Rob, I'll add, both of our undergraduate degrees are in education, and one of the things that is, the educators think about is how do we teach things so that people can truly understand what's being taught. And again, our intention was these are supposed to be, fun, kind of funny images. We realized, this brings back memories to some of you of the 60s, which was just a really rough and sinful time. And, when I come to the Beatitudes, it's such a familiar passage, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek. I can read through the Beatitudes and not even pay attention to that I read the Beatitudes because they're so familiar. And I'll tell you what this has done for me, especially, pondering just how rough the 60s were, is to go back and think what it was like in the first century, the world that Jesus came into. And if you want to talk about a sinful culture, the Roman Empire in the first century, it was a pretty sinful place. And I'll tell you what this has done for me as one, hearing the sermons is a reminder that when Jesus is saying, blessed are the meek and blessed are the peacemakers, I mean, he's saying it to a group of people who are living in just a very rough time. So, I would say from an educator standpoint, this is stirring us up, and it's causing us to think. And the hope would be that we take the Beatitudes more seriously, because quite honestly, our day's pretty rough too. I don't think we've gotten tamer, since the 60s. We live in a rough day today, and the same message that Jesus gives us is in a difficult time. So, hey, land people, come back up. We got some more questions about land.
Okay.
And one is, weren't we planning on building a sanctuary out in the front? Wasn't that part of the original plan? And are we still planning to build that sanctuary?
Another good question. When we moved over here, there was a long-range plan for the building and the property, and so I would say two things. Number one is I think our intent, at least my intent. I won't speak for everybody because I haven't talked with everybody about this yet. But my intent is to try and have some of those conversations to make sure we understand what the intent of the land was, because I've heard lots of things and rumors, and it's unclear to me what the actual intent of some of the land was. I've heard everything from seminaries to schools to restaurants, and so I think there's still some work for our group to do to try and discern some of that. So the other piece of that is, I would say, really directly related to COVID, because I think it's unclear to us how many people moving forward you can really put into a room at one time.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of uncertainty around that. I don't know that there is long-term value for us as a church in having services 2 or 3 times on a Sunday that have 12 to 1,500 people in them. And I know that seems a little bit sort of a different a sort of narrative than we've talked about before, but really what I feel like for me has been pressed upon my heart during this time is that, you know, the early church didn't really have church buildings, and they traveled around as itinerant ministers, ministering to smaller house churches. And we have a small groups ministry here, and I think that there may be actually some convergence happening there with the work that Glen has done with the small groups ministry, and how just culturally things are changing for us. And so I don't know that I would say, no, we're not building a sanctuary, but I think that just creates lots of questions for, at least for me personally, like on what does that look like, and how do we adapt to COVID and the time that we're in. So I hope that's helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, JT, don't go anywhere because I got another question.
Well,
I want to add
follow up.
something.
But that's not something Session has had any
Yes, correct.
lengthy conversation about. I think what JT is grabbing a hold of, at least to some degree, is it's really unclear with COVID what exactly ministry of rhythm looks like. There's 2/3 of our congregation currently that doesn't worship on site. I don't know what the future will look like. It would not surprise me if over half our congregation going forward doesn't worship on site long term, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. And this is all new territory, trying to navigate through what's the gospel look like, and how do we do this in a way that is good and right and life-giving. And so a question of a 1,200-seat sanctuary becomes less of a clarity because there's so much about COVID that becomes unclear. So there's another.
And I was just going to say, because I'm going to anticipate, because some are going to say, well, COVID might go away in a year, and we don't know what's going to happen post-COVID.
Fair.
But I will say these are trends, that I've been following for at least the last 15 years, pointing forward is not really large churches, but smaller churches that are church planting churches. If you're following some of the larger pastors like Tim Keller and Matt Chandler who've gone to the multi-site model, they're actually abandoning the multi-site and spinning off their multi-sites and saying these need to be smaller congregations. And so I think, absolutely COVID's a factor, but this has been a trend that's been, as folks look ahead, and we study the millennial generation, we study Generation Z, and, we look ahead, what's on the horizon is a lot of smaller churches that are more intimate. And in fact, even if we sell land, we still have enough land to build many, many things if we want. Here's a couple more questions, JT. What factors are driving the need to sell the land quickly? And so I would say 2 parts there. What are the factors? Why do we want to sell the land? And then is it quickly? Are we trying to do it quickly or?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. So we pulled the stats about how much. So let's just focus on the north lot for the sake of the discussion. How much the north lot, the north shelter house and fields are used. Over the past 2 years, and so my numbers are probably going to be a little off, but they're directionally correct. I think that area has been used in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 different times. But of those uses, there's only been about 40 to 50 that have been directly related to church ministry activities. And so what does that mean? That means like when the youth group has met, the senior high has met out at the shelter house, or the junior high has been out there, or the school's been out there, things like that. The other, 250 occurrences are things that I do because I've had 2 kids' birthdays out there during COVID, which has been fantastic. But I don't know that I love my kids and they're a gift from God, but I don't know that they're furthering the ministries of Southport Pres in and of that singular event, even though birthday parties are great. There's that we can easily shift some of those things that we're doing, like the senior high kickoffs, into another area, either the south parking lot, the south lawn, and we've really not diminished any of their effectiveness in doing ministry work. One of the other things that's driving some quickness around this is that there has been a little bit of a rise in property value. And so it behooves us to move quickly to try and take advantage of that while we can.
This is a land question, but I think it's a Rob question.
Oh.
In the past we've had a sports ministry. Is it on the horizon to hire another sports minister? Do we foresee relaunching a sports ministry in the future? And then does the sale of the land in any way prohibit us from having a future sports ministry?
So I'll do it backwards. Does the sale of the land, well, in fairness and honesty, we don't know what land and how much we would think would be good for the congregation to sell. So in some ways it'd be difficult to answer that, but we are sitting on 25 acres, and there's a lot of that is green. And so just about anything that we do in one part of our property could actually be done someplace else. So there's, if my math is correct, if we wanted to start a baseball ministry again, right, we got plenty of space on the south side or even on the west side where the master plan would have had the congregation or the sanctuary that's not yet built, or soccer fields, for example. We got plenty of land to do that if we wanted to do that. At this point, I've not been in any formal conversations about relaunching the sports ministry. I think some of the things that we found about sports ministry was that we had put a lot of people in our building, but did not actually translate into a lot of really good, life-giving, Christ-building relationships. But that's not a conversation that's been ongoing. Doesn't mean that we couldn't have that conversation in the future, right? So to sum this, what I just simply say is, like, we're always open for what the Lord might be doing. My language, as I've kind of been brought into this, is I don't think the sale of a part of our land keeps us from doing anything that we're currently doing or that we would likely do in the future, quite honestly. And in some ways, if you just look at the north lot, there's a lot of maintenance that goes into the area, so it actually takes some resources. The shelter house itself takes a lot of time and attention to keep it maintained, and we have a number of folks that we will routinely have to go and interact with who have moved into it and had to help them find another spot. So, yeah. We're probably getting close to the end.
Yeah,
so.
we're a lot of more questions. Will call us at the office. We'd love to answer these. I do want to share one thing though that I think's relevant. Is another member of the finance committee has messaged in and wants to clarify that we are not in financial trouble. And so remember, and it's in caps, that we are not in financial trouble, and so we do not have a pressing need. In that we're not in trouble.
Yeah.
Right? These are opportunities that are on the horizon.
So we're recording this. You can go back and watch again what Joe was sharing. That this is a horizon conversation. It's a longer term conversation about where we want God to move us, and some of it is connected to long term building questions and staff, how we care for our staff and compensate our staff, and the land. So, yeah.
And he says we are looking for the best deployment of our resources. That's the intent. We've got resources. We want to use them to accomplish our kingdom purposes.
Yeah,
it's not about being in panic.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, why don't you tell everybody that we're done or all the
I
wonderful
thought you said you had one
thing-
more really great
No,
question.
there's a lot of questions,
Oh.
and so y'all got to call us or email us.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's time for me.
It'd be too many to answer.
Oh. Yeah, it's time for me to.
Yeah, reruns of Murder, She Wrote come on in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's an image I don't think I'll get out of my mind, Glenn. Thanks for that. Well, so thanks for joining us, and our hope and our heart really is actually for us to be doing all that God would have us to do. And so, again, thanks email Glen or email us with questions, call, that kind of thing. We sure know there are more questions than we were able to answer. And thanks for joining us. God bless you.